and welcome to the first online event in the ongoing series, Era of Reclamation. I'm Hartwig Fischer, Director of the British Museum. Era of Reclamation is a project conceived and curated by playwright, novelist, critic, journalist, and broadcaster Bonnie Greer. It goes back to conversations Bonnie and I began in spring 2019. I invited Bonnie to curate a project at the museum, and through various iterations, we identified reclamation as a key aspect of our time and felt we wanted to explore it. We understand reclamation as the need and the desire to reclaim rights, recognition, opportunity, equality, justice, history and heritage, memory, identity, voice. So after a year of conversation and co-curation, we launched the Era of Reclamation this past January, beginning with a series of conversations at the British Museum. The first was entitled In Search of Black History, inspired by Bonnie's groundbreaking series for Audible, with guest speakers Miranda Lowe, Valika Smelders, and Professor Olivette Otele. The second event saw Bonnie in conversation with broadcaster and author June Sarpong, Director of Creative Diversity at the BBC. And the third event asked the question, is the Caribbean the key, addressing the importance of the Caribbean in the unfolding of human history, with a number of guests from the UK and the Caribbean. So today I'm pleased to welcome back Bonnie and her guest, distinguished scholar and author Olivette Otele. Olivette is Professor of the History of Slavery at Bristol University, and she's Vice President of the Royal Historical Society. She is an expert in the history of people of African descent and the links between memory, geopolitics, and the legacies of both French and British colonialism. Her fascinating new book, African Europeans, An Untold History, explores the history of African European heritage. It is the subject of today's discussion. The book examines stories that have been long overlooked, and it also sheds light on questions that are very much alive today. So without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Bonnie Greer and our honored guest, Olivette Otele. Bonnie, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Hartwig, for that introduction and welcome. And welcome all of you to a talk that I excited is not even the description, but it's part of what I feel in having this talk with Olivette, who Hartwig introduced beautifully, and to talk about her new book. And book is what it is, but it's much more than that. And I hope we can get to show you that. It's called African Europeans, An Untold History. Now, I have to tell you, Olivette, something that's probably going to be quite bizarre. I began reading the book backwards. I don't quite know. Oh, forgot to tell you all out there. There will be 15 minutes Q&A at the end. So have your questions ready. Ask what you like, because that's what this conversation is about. And that's what the Era of Reclamation is about. So Olivette, as I was saying, I was reading this book backwards, and I don't even know why I did that, but I'm glad I did. I found my name in it. Now, you know, I'm only saying that because the title of the book is African Europeans, and I was born on the south side of Chicago. I mean, I've lived here half my life, but I thought, I'm not a European. And then I realized as I went through the book that this is a provocation that you've made. It's not just a title. It's a provocation, it's a challenge, it's a dare. Can you tell me about what that title means?
Yes, I certainly can. Thank you so much, Hartwig and the British Museum for inviting me. And of course, I'm excited and completely honored and humbled to be talking with you, Bonnie. Before we even start, you have fantastic art behind you. What is this?
Oh, this is a piece by the British Nigerian artist Lanre Olagoke. This is, I think it's kind of me. Now, I didn't do this on purpose. It's only because I like talking in his studio. It gives me a lot of energy. I like being around artists of African descent. And I got lots of books, but I wanted to be here. And I want his work to be around.
I can understand why, because it's absolutely outstanding pieces of work. Well done to him. So about your, the title, yeah, it is a provocation because it's really about several strands that I have been examining over the last, 20 years or so. And it was really hard for me to bring them together. And then, and then I decided that, why not go for it? And then if it doesn't make sense to people, well, tough, because it does make sense to me. It's about identity. And it's about, trying to shift our perception of what identity is. And yes, you're in the book because, oh, I'm not European. Well, actually, yes, you are. You don't want to admit it, but it's a sense of home. It's the idea of home. Home is where many things are. Home is not necessarily where we say it is. It's where our heart is. It's where our experiences, some of our experiences made us, transformed us, are. So I see you as an African European, sorry.
We're going to get into you defining this because you've actually invented this in many ways. And so what I want to take our viewers through is that journey inside of you, because this is not only superb research. This is another way of thinking. So I want to start with the Kushite Empire and the Kingdom of Kush, and Strabo and the Kandaki Queens and the beautiful Marrowhead that's at the British Museum, which people, they want to talk about statue toppling. You need to tell that story because that's the ultimate statue topple.
Yes, I wanted to put so much in this book, and the obvious place for me was really to start with a research done, decades ago by Shekanta Diop. When he was saying he was looking at the origins of Africa and how he actually started a fierce controversy about kind of a culture. African culture and the density of African culture, and not just the density, but he wanted to trouble the way Europeans were perceiving African culture and African history. And he is somebody, he did his studies at the Sorbonne, just like myself, and he's somebody who really, really greatly influenced me. Shekanta Diop was a historian, and there's a university named after him in Dakar in Senegal. And he was somebody who was looking at the borders, the fluidity of borders. And when I started this journey, I see myself as an African European. So it was about telling to the world, this is who I am, and this is the many pieces that I am. And that journey was born out of experiences. I was born in Cameroon, and I grew up in Paris. And I live in the UK. And all these experiences have shaped who I am, because identity is constantly shifting, despite what everyone wants to believe. It's not just where you're born, it's whatever you become as you grow old. So yeah, that's a provocation, one of the many provocations of this book, really.
What's so fascinating about you, sort of beginning with the Marrowhead and that great top of the head of Caesar Augustus that one of the Kandaki queens actually toppled and then buried. so that the people actually walked on this guy's head. I mean, it's at the British Museum, you should see it, it's amazing. And this was a Black woman. This was a woman, and what's so amazing about Africa, for me, in Africa, is the strength of matrilineal, of the matriarchal, of matrilineal power of, you know, you can look at Egypt and see all this sort of svelte beauty of Egypt. And then you go on the other side, you go to what is now Sudan and the Kushite Empire, you see another thing. And I'm always amazed in this era, and still now, with the agency that women have in African culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved talking about this story as well, because the Kandake were the mothers, supposedly the mothers of the king. In other words,
what years are we talking about, Olivette? What year are we talking
about? The Meroe, for example, the queens of Kushite, they were supposed to be the mothers of the queens. In other words, a secondary role. But in fact, they had the power. They're the one who protected the kingdom. Military strategy was decided by them, and these women were powerful. So what was interesting for me is that, of course, specialists and experts know that story, but it was about a perception of what Black women were at the time that has been completely forgotten. So it's the power of that story that completely amazed me. And I had to bring it about again to life, because you and I have been having this long conversation about, you know, women, Black women in these societies, and how we make our way, we find our ways, and how we navigate different tides, really, in ways that sometimes are seen as either too mild, or too provocative, or too aggressive, but always in keeping of what we believe to be the ultimate. In other words, we see the prize, we see the ending before everyone sees it. I don't know, it makes sense to me.
I completely, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up as well is what you demonstrate at the beginning of the book, which I think is so important in Black history, so important, is the agency, the equality of Africa and Europe. That there was a moment in time when they faced each other like this. It wasn't this, it wasn't this, it was this. Yeah. And there wasn't any question about that in a very interesting way. So the queens become the symbol of that equality. And I want to move into the so-called European Middle Ages, because that's really fascinating as well. I've had the privilege of seeing St. Moritz at Magdeburg in Germany, and I was not prepared for him. I was in the cathedral, I was doing some filming, and they said, oh, you have to go see St. Moritz. And I was okay. I went over and I saw this Black man, and I want to stress that, because it was not an idealized image of a Black man, the bust, and it was an African face. This was somebody who had studied and looked at an African face and decided this was beautiful. He wasn't idealized, he wasn't eroticized, he looked like my brother. He was beautiful. And so I became really interested in what was the African presence to the European medieval mind. I've also seen several Black Madonnas, including the one that's in England, Walsingham. And I've seen the Black Madonna in Krakow, and the ones in the south of France. And you have to, as a person of African descent, stand back and think, what's going on here? What's happening here?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we have, they're like signs that are not incredibly highlighted in European history, that the one that we taught, but actually these are powerful, powerful symbols of a past. So St. Moritz, just to give you a background, St. Moritz was born in what is nowadays Egypt, the Thebes region, and he was a soldier. And he was a soldier who was working in the Roman Empire. And he became a martyr because he disobeyed, he didn't disobey orders, but he refused to pray to God Jupiter before battle. Anyway, he was executed with his companions. And that symbol of St. Maurice became a sign of resistance, religious resistance. He was Christianized. His myth was Christianized. And the legend, he became a legend as well, traveled across countries to reach what is nowadays Germany. And throughout that journey, he was transformed as a Christian hero. So his blackness was a symbol of the power of redemption, power of European, the Roman.
The Magi too, in a sense, as well.
Pardon?
As it was the Magi as well.
Exactly. So he reaches across the board. So the Madonnas have the same transformation. They're everywhere because they are truly part of African and European history. So what was interesting for me is to see how we talked about the question of erasure, right? How this part of the story has been completely forgotten. So you have a statue, a beautiful statue that is not necessarily contextualized, and they certainly don't tell you that this was an African European, because they were both were figures of European history and religious history as well. So yeah, I'm fascinated by them as well.
You know, one of the things that, you talk about forgetting, what you demonstrate in the book and what you prove and you show is that there's a moment, and first of all, I just want to give a shout out to the first Medici Duke, which was always a controversy about whether he was a man of African descent, the Medici. And of course, now you lay out the story of the founder of this great dynasty, the rulers practically of Italy during the Middle Ages, and huge patrons of art, huge story of Europe in the medieval time, Medici. And this began with a man whose mother was of African descent in Italy. So we have this land, we have this Europe as a place where Africans are there. And I would suppose not so much to say equal, but they were not others in a sense. They, in fact, actually, you could say that the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Empire used the African presence as sort of advertisements for their kind of worldwide, superiority. So that if you could get a guy from Ethiopia to be part of you, then we were like the big deals, So it was never ever a sense of Black people being sort of inferior. But what is interesting and what you really kind of made clear to me for the first time, people use the term the fall of Constantinople. And suddenly you read this in history, you studied history, and you have an image in your mind, and there's Constantinople. Actually, the fall of Constantinople was the beginning of what we understand as Europe, which technically, the fall of Constantinople demonstrates that Europe is what I call a super peninsula, that it in fact is not a continent, it is a piece of Asia. And the fall of Constantinople ushers in something very different, particularly for people of African descent. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's the beginning of kind of a sedimentation or hardening of borders, if you would. It's the time when Europeans, as we know them today, are starting to delineate their borders in terms of not just geographic borders, but intellectual and religious borders, by saying that we are different. This is where we sit. This is where we are. Whereas before that, the Muslim world had Black African sub-Saharan people, in fact, quite a long time, way a long time before anybody else, meaning Europeans. And this is also the time when Christianity or Christendom becomes the be-all and end-all. It becomes a place of myth, a place where you think race in terms as we see it today. It becomes a place of redefining European intellectual journey. Whereas, the journey has always been there, but they rewrite European history at that moment, and it has not ceased since then. So you have them and us. starting to form in a way that is more set, I have to say. What is also interesting is that you start having as well, 15th century, roughly, medieval, you start having a definition of terms like the Saracen, the Moors, and all the rest of it as insults. As you know, the Muslim world being seen as inferior because they venerate, or rather they follow the followers of Muhammad. Whereas on the other side, in the Muslim world, Christians are just Christians. They might be the enemy in terms of power, military, but they're not necessarily inferior. There's no derogatory meaning attached to it. And that for me was really interesting, because anybody else then south of these places becomes the unknown.
Yes.
That was known before that.
Yes.
So it's a rewriting of history, really.
You know what you've also laid clear for me, so a theory that I've always kind of had, and you've laid it out in this book beautifully. We don't talk a lot about the Reconquista. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about as an American, I get Isabel and Ferdinand, they sent out Columbus and all that, but we don't really get what they did and how they, in fact, in the reconquest, and it means the reconquest of Spain from Islam, and they began to actually have degrees of who was Christian, who was Jewish, and that began to apply to people of African descent as well. And something happened. Yeah. And it was clear, it's clear. And we never ever go to that moment when Europe, as you say, Europe becomes this bulwark, this continent, when it isn't. It suddenly becomes this thing that is a defense. And I think that's when color begins to really come in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Muslim world has its own, definition of color, and the gradation and the hierarchy and all that. But what is interesting to me is, with the period of the Reconquista, is that they don't just kick the Muslims out of what they see as Europe. They define who is European, color-wise. In other words, you have this position of different identities. For example, the Moriscos were Muslims who have, who stayed in Spain and Portugal, in the Iberian Peninsula. And these people are going to start, will be ostracized, massacred by number if they refuse, first of all, to, to change religion, to convert. Yeah, if they refuse to convert, they become the enemy. They're seen as inferior from that moment on. You have the Jewish community that has been ostracized by all of them, that is also classified as inferior. And then you have people who are of African descent, kind of sub-Sahara or North Africa, or who have darker skin, who are also seen as inferior, even though they're Christians. So you have different categories that are put in place. Being Europeans in the mind, ideologically meant being Christian and being white, of white skin, if you would, whiter skin, because Spain, the population of Spain also had different gradation. But so, yeah, you see that being put in place. And, Isabella and Ferdinand coming together, it's really two superpowers and two ideologies meeting and deciding to become an empire. And it worked, because then they were able to fund different, different voyages that later on went onto the conquest of the Americas, if you would, ruthlessly. So
the concept of Negro, and you talk about that.
Yes.
You talk about, because on my birth certificate is the word Negro, and my generation is the one that decided we weren't going to be Negroes anymore. And so this word, this term, can you talk about it? Because it exists still in the unconscious in Europe, very much.
Oh yeah, it does. And it nègre in French is supposed to be an insult, except when it's a Senghor saying it, But anyway, that's a different conversation. Let's go back to the term Negro that starts by meaning black, as in a black person. But little by little, instead of black person, Negro becomes slave or enslaved person. And then, and those two become interchangeable. You don't say a black person anymore, although a black person could have been a free person. But in people's mind, it becomes really set as well as an identity. So Negro becomes a category, an identity that is actually put on people. Nobody decides to call themselves Negro. It's the conquerors. It's the colonial powers who decide that this is going to be how it is. And it starts with the Spanish, Portuguese, and then the Dutch have the same term. I think it's Negrin or Negern, rather.
Yes.
The same term. And then the French choose nègre. And the British is even more interesting because they have Negro, but they also have nigger. So they're playing with those both terms as an insult or not. But, you know, there's always this ambiguity that exists, and we all know why it is there, you know. America.
Olivette, you know, one of the things that is so groundbreaking about African Europeans is that you almost present the African, a person of African descent, as kind of the dual between Europe as these nation states begin to define themselves. In fact, the Africa itself, but particularly the African body, becomes the kind of fence in which these countries, Spain, England, France, Germany, Italy, and Portugal, are defining themselves in relation to themselves. So that as a result, and of course, when the slave trade is discovered, when that is seen as a way to enhance these nation states, the African begins to become a commodity, a thing.
The African is so many things. He is or she is a commodity, and she's something else, a currency. She is a currency, I say she, but they are currencies. They are reproductive tools. They are labor. And above all, in terms of identity, they are the one that help Europe present itself as evolved, as intellectually superior. A few years ago, I wrote an edited, I co-edited a volume, and I chose the title, Does Discrimination Shape Identity? Yes, it does, because you construct your identity in opposition to the other. In some cases, that's exactly what Europe did.
And that I think is one of the sort of revolutionary things that you show, is that the pawn that we still are. I mean, in fact, it's Europe defines itself, and European states define itself against us, against the relationship with us, and Africa becomes the big us. So when you and I first met, which was mind-blowing to me, your study of Agore, of the Senghor, all of that, and that bridge between real African Europeans in a classical sense. Can you talk about those women? Because this is something that we don't talk a lot about in Black history, and we need to, because these relationships were key.
I really think so. And I think that before we even start, I just wanted to say that just imagine we are in 17th, 18th century, and then 19th century. Colonial spaces have been defined by economic power by Europeans. They hold the power. They are the conquerors in a way. And then you have African coast. And in African coast, they still met with different communities, different groups that they have to negotiate with to actually acquire labor and African captives and food and other stuff. Okay, so they're going to, European traders and sailors and all these people are going to settle there, build forts, and have children with African women. And in Senegal, those women, those children are called, the women ones, the female ones are called les signares. And the signares are going to become a whole category on their own. They're African European, but I chose to call them European African just to reverse a bit, just to make a different distinction, because they are both European in the sense that they adopt Catholicism. They are completely immersed in the trade with Europe. They order their cloth and all the stuff from Nantes, Bordeaux, La Rochelle, Lisbon, Seville, European, you know, they're cosmopolitan in a way. But at the same time, these women are really embedded in their communities because Senegal majority, vast majority Muslim. These women are Catholic, but actually they are also animist in many other ways. So they're traders. They trade in gold, and when they trade in human beings, and when it doesn't work anymore, they trade in rubber. And when it doesn't work anymore, they reinvent themselves and become healers. In other words, going back to Africanity and their African roots. It's a question of survival. You know, when you do a history, you try not to put, you think, oh, they were actually slave traders. Yes, they were. They were slave traders and they were survivors in this environment of 18th century where the most important commodity was human labor, captivity, and human African captives. So listening to those stories, learning about these stories was very important for me to also point out that African Europeans are a complex group. You know, it's not a good versus bad. It's a whole lot of people who are born out of different really incredible experiences. And then on the other side, on the Dutch, nowadays Ghana, you have the Gar women, where same kind of upbringing, if you would. But the difference between Senegal and the Gar women in Ghana is that the Gar women in Ghana have some form of agency, some form of power limited to that region. Whereas the Signares were economically powerful. They were, as I said, you know, they were in politics. Their children were in politics. They own land. They made the decision. And in fact, at some point you have Europeans, young Europeans, white, male, coming to Senegal to try and marry these women because they were part of some form of aristocracy in the 18th century and 19th century. Yeah, they're powerful women. The story of women surviving in different environments is quite interesting for me to look at as well.
You know, I want to jump out of the historical trajectory for a second because you hit on something that is important. And partly what the era of reclamation, curation is about reclaiming. Yeah. Not only history, but memory. And you are an archivist of memory. You're an historian of memory. And of course, the erasure of memory is the supreme task of colonialization and enslavement, is to erase our memory. One of the things that we're looking at, and you as well as part of the project, is how, and I'm going to use the word impose, and it's not a good word, but I want to use it because I can't think of another, how politics imposes. My generation, and my generation is the 60s generation, the Black Panther generation, the story you just told, we didn't want to know that, okay? We didn't want to know that there were Black people who were complicit in the transatlantic slave trade. And I'm going to use that word in a broad sense. We didn't want that in there. When I went to Elmina and figured out that something else was going on here besides white people going up because they couldn't have taken it, that was a huge shock to me, and it's really changed my life. Mm-hmm. So I want you to talk a little bit about how politics impinges, in a sense.
Yeah, for me, you know, many people disagree, and I understand what they're coming from, but for me, history is politics. And politics, you make your history, especially when you're in power. So we as people are uncomfortable with certain truths. certain truths, historically we have documents, you know, you can't evade that. It happened, this is how it is. So in the African continent, you had a variety of forms of captivity and subjugation. Some were servants, some weren't. Some could redeem their, you know, could buy their freedom, some couldn't. Some came from families that were born into enslavement. In other words, their parents, their grandparents, their ancestors are coming from a line of servants who would work for the monarchs and serve the monarch as a family, you know, as a descent. And we still have the legacy of that today in certain countries. And this is what my research that was funded by the European Union was about. It was about the legacies of the past in post-slavery society. We know about Europe, but there is a legacy of the past in post-slavery society, Senegal, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Mauritius, and all that. So that was part of the research. And when I started looking at archival material there, I found so many stories that I couldn't put in the book. And those stories were all the jigsaw, you know, all the participation and all the people and especially families who are in power still today and who were the descendant of those powerful families who sold African captives.
So we don't like ambiguity and complexity because the other side of the story is so big. And in fact, you know, if you talk about the transatlantic slave trade in terms of the whole history of the world and of African people, is yesterday. Mm. And we're very much, because the drama of it, because so many of us are descended from it, it's linked, it's so, and we can't kind of look beyond the kind of complexity.
Yeah, it is very painful. And I just wanted to say something. So it's not just powerful kingdoms selling people who are working for them. It's also the dislocation and dismantling of families. In other words, I heard that all my life. I heard it in the Caribbean, I heard it in the States, I heard it in France, when you have people who know that I was born in Cameroon saying, you sold us. And my answer as a historian is I listen because it's coming from a place of pain. But I have to say, as a historian, try and imagine members of the same family, some being sold and some staying. What happened to those who stayed? A lot happened to them. It's also part of my research. And we need to tell those stories, the stories of those who stayed as well, because their life was completely transformed, a whole shift completely changed. So we need to talk about that as well. Yeah, complexity make people uncomfortable, but we are human, so it comes with a territory, isn't it?
It does, and because we are not in control yet of our story, of our names in many ways. It's certainly not my name. There is always a kind of trying to set as much as we can, especially as the younger generations, to set the narrative as much as possible, because then within the narrative, you can at least begin to breathe a little bit and to tell stories. Mm-hmm. I want you very much to talk about one of the things that I am sort of concerned about as an African American, as a person who was born in Chicago, is I consider the ubiquity of African American discourse on the whole of the Black world, particularly the younger the generation has become. Even the term Black Lives Matter is utterly an American term. We all know what it means. We all agree with it, but it's as American as apple pie. And, you know, I'm thinking to myself, some woman walking down the street in Paris going, Black Lives Matter. I mean, you know, I know what it means, but it's so American. And that, in fact, it becomes a kind of polarization in which people don't realize how Americanized the whole of the movement and languages. And you push back against this in a chapter that I need you to explain to people, because in France, you call yourself l'enfant de la République. I said it in rhetorical French, but this idea of France is looking add color, it's completely the opposite in many ways of how we think it is, because our trope is African American, Black British. France is a different story. And some of the things that happened in France, particularly with the women, with the feminists there, I need you to tell that story and how France is.
Yeah, you know, France is based on color blindness. We all became French. 1848, abolition of slavery in France, and then we're all French, people, particularly people from the Caribbean region, and all that. So it's about the Republic defining itself as colorblind. In other words, we are supposed to be all equal, and the question of race is really something that is troubling. So if you go through the journey of race, then you find inequality and you find history, and an ugly history of conquest and subjugation. So we don't go there, but racism exists. You know, it's a reality for most of us. It was, at least for me, growing up in Paris for many, many decades. So how do you go on about it? You can't address racism as such because it's not supposed to exist. So you have a group of young women, and I'm incredibly humbled by them.
They're amazing.
My generation, we compromised much more.
Mine too.
Much, much more. They are uncompromising. They walk with their truth. And in terms of the Afrofeminists, in terms of the Black Lives Matter, they don't take the movement as it is from the States. They actually use the movement to tell their own story. So it could be anybody else. It could be another movement. Other movements will come, but specifically for France, different for the British though. Specifically for France, it's like another opportunity to fight and to tag along a powerful movement to say this is very specific to France. We will not put up with this. So they Black, they French, not necessarily just Europeans.
Yes.
Specifically French, and they claim their Frenchness. They're not French from so-and-so origin. They're French, you know. Some of them are Muslim, some aren't. And all this needs to be encompassed and understood as part of their identity. And of course, there's a pushback because when you become peculiar and singular, there's a singularity to them, then the ideal of the Republic is we're all together, we're all the same. It becomes troubling, and therefore there was and there still is a pushback against Afrofeminists in France. But that fight doesn't stop there, though, you know. So
we, when we do our language, when we talk about this, we take Anglo-American discourse, Anglo-American point of view, which is actually about a liberal state. I mean, we as, you know, Anglo-Americans, British, Black British, we're declaring our part in the state. We are in it. We're in it. We're defining ourselves. We're in it. Whereas if you go to France, Germany, Spain, Holland, the Netherlands, Sweden, this is another other story because, in a sense, what Moissy did, which you know, this is stunning. They basically, in France, of course, you have the whole idea of the Simone de Beauvoir feminists, oh, we're all the same, everybody's a woman, you know, we all suffer, la, la, la. And these young women were saying, no, we're not all the same. We're proud to say we're not all the same. Not only that, we're gonna make a space where we can say it and you can't come. And so it becomes the opposite in many ways. Kind of general idea of what we understand about it. And that's why I mean about the ubiquity of, I guess, British American discourse in this story.
I find it fascinating as well because these women are saying, you know, you haven't been able to include us in the feminist movement. And typically the Me Too movement is a particular, it's a very revealing example. Me Too movement in France started in the US by an African-American woman.
That's right.
It was mostly represented by white women.
That's right.
You know, and nobody saw the problem with that, with the fact that very few Black women were actually involved in that movement because, you know, feminism is supposed to represent everybody, but they didn't notice that Black women weren't there. So these women are saying, you didn't notice, well, we're going to create our own spaces. And you can't come because in those spaces, we are able to share and talk about the pain that, the daily microaggression, but also the deep pain that exists. Because when you are in multicultural spaces, black and white spaces, if you would, you as a black person, you refrain from telling how you feel and what you feel for fear sometimes of hurting your white allies, if you would. So you can't completely unload or the burden onto those spaces. And that was the reason why they created those spaces. And it was perceived as discrimination. This is interesting. Is perceived as discrimination.
That's kind of what I mean by this idea of African European, and why your book is so important, because you take us out of what I call the American British trope of assuming that we know what this is, assuming that we know what blackness is in relation to European states. And when you're in a country, when you're in France, when you're in Sweden, where it's just like, oh, we're all the same. In fact, in French law, that's true. So you suddenly, French women of African descent who walk out of that are saying, no, it's not true. We have to separate ourselves. We have to show you this because it's not true. We don't want to be included because the inclusion is false. The inclusion is false.
Not that way. And I have just one thing I have to say that, Sweden, Denmark and other places in the Netherlands have this, they're struggling with the same kind of things. But what is interesting for me is that they are able to connect with other Europeans. Something the UK is looking up to the Americas and Europe is just next door. And
exactly.
That troubles me too.
It troubles me deeply, and it worries me as I've lived here half my life. And I can see both sides of this. Partly it's social media, the ubiquity of social media, and people grab slogans, they grab things, seeing a murder like the murder of George Floyd. Anybody, a decent human being would get involved in fighting that as best they can and what's created. But the assumption within the whole of this arc of blackness is that it's the same thing is not true. And this is what African Europeans, that's what I mean by the provocation. Because in you putting me in there as someone born, in America, is the provocation of saying, I want you to look at these two words. Don't think you know what it is. Don't think you know what it means. It's not only about a position on the continent, it's about a mind. It's about how you see the world. We have one more minute before we go to questions. And Olivette, what do you want to say? Because I have a feeling why did you do this book? What made you do it?
It's a personal journey. It's me as a child of both worlds growing up and seeing what I saw and not seeing the boundaries that have been imposed upon us as in African Europeans, people of African descent, European. I don't see those boundaries. They're there, of course, geographically in terms of passport IDs and all that. But this is not what I see. This is not my deepest reality. My emotional reality is not there. So I needed to say that by showing that it was not always there, historically speaking. It's also about my children who are, they're Cameroonian, they're French, they're British, and specifically they're Welsh. And they have identities from all these countries, but it's just a piece of paper, but it's also an emotional, strong emotional connection with all these spaces that, So I wanted to say that we don't have to be just one thing, and even what we are now evolves, and that's okay.
I think we got questions. Look, I'm a complete. Okay, hang on. Let me see. Landry is not only an artist. He's okay. Okay. Yes, I'm ready. Yes. Next question. Where's the question?
See, I can't see.
I'm not going to hide the fact that I'm
just going to follow you.
Because I don't see any point. Okay. Gerald, who works in the area of late antique Egypt and early Christianity, asked this question. That was a Chicago accent, asked. Do you think it's important for more Black people to do research in the area of late antiquity? Thank you for that, Gerald.
Yes, 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 please, 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 please. I mean, I can never express how much it is important. These are spaces that, you know, talking to students, Black students, they believe they don't have anything to do with, you know, it has nothing to do with them. It does. You take up the space you want to take, not what the space people have been allocating you. So please do, yeah, wholeheartedly.
Go for it, Gerald. Okay, next. What's happening? Is there another question? Lonnie has to do all of this. I'm not gonna, okay. Sorry, it takes so long. Okay. This is to both of us.
Okay.
What is your opinion on taking down statues of figures associated with the transatlantic slave trade? If that question didn't make it in, I would have been really disappointed. All right.
Okay. I'm going to answer both ways. The historian in me loves to see the relics of the past preserved somewhere, like a museum. The activist in me is saying, we're not talking about just any statue. If we're talking about Colston, that conversation had been taking place for decades. And the young Generation Z decided that enough talking, this is time for action. And they did it. And I was gasping. Me who's been writing, researching, and fighting for this, I was gasping because they didn't ask me. They decided to do it. I would just say that we have to be careful, though, about venerating the statues rather than the history of people associated with those statues. So that's what I would say, yeah. Your turn, Bonnie.
I would say that I agree with you. The historian in me would say, don't take them down, because there will be a time, and I've lived long enough to say this, there'll be a time when people didn't think they existed. They won't believe you that they were there or what they are. So it's always best to teach, extend the story, because all of these stories are big, they're hidden, and we need statues sometimes to talk about. I mean, this country is full of what I call Victorian tat, basically. All these statues in these public spaces, what the heck? You know, so taking down a statue is a political act. It is what people felt they needed to do. But I want people not to forget that statue was there and to understand why that statue is there, which is much more important than the statue. So take the thing down and put it in a museum of ugliness or whatever you want to do, and teach people that's what it's in there for, or recontextualize the statue or the bust. Put it amongst the things that it created so that people can learn so that it doesn't happen again. And that's how I feel about it. Mm-hmm. So we got another question, right? How do I do these other questions? Can you show me how to do the other question? Because I don't know how. Oh, he ran away. Right. Okay. My friend ran away.
Oh gosh. Okay. The other question. You want to type a question or you want to?
I don't know. Anyway.
No, we're supposed to read them.
Yes, but I need to have it on my.
Oh.
And off. Oh, okay. Sorry, we don't know how to do this. So. Let's see, let's try this.
And see what it says.
No, that's not helping either. Sorry about that. Oh, wow, here we go. Oh, it worked. What will it take? This is William. What will it take to heal the historic divide between white Europeans and people of African descent?
What it takes is telling the story, not erasure. Erasure creates not just an easiness, but pain. That's why I'm also working on memory. It creates pain and dislocation and sense of worthlessness. So if we're completely honest, as much as we can, telling those stories, using archives if we want to, but also using the memories of those whose ancestors were the stories transmitted by the ancestors through oral history. I think that's the only way. We're still grappling with, oh, we shouldn't tell that story, and we should celebrate so-and-so instead of so-and-so. We're still at that point where we're not even telling the story as it happened, and as archives are telling us. So we're far away from healing. We can't heal until we know what happened.
Can I ask you a question about memory? Because you are a historian of memory, of slavery, and a curator of memory. I want to ask it very quickly. I feel very strongly that as the descendant of enslaved people, and particularly in America, where we were told we were nothing, we had no history. For me, an African statue, even in a Western museum, even in the global North, gives me memory. Now, I know how they got there. I know the whole story, but I see my face. And is there a place for that kind of exchange, that kind of curation, particularly for the descendants of enslaved people?
Of course there is. This is what matters to me as well. It's finding those spaces that talk to us. I was born in Cameroon, and I hear the story about artifacts being stolen. And my first instinct is, oh, they should restore them. We have to remember that also, just like you, you grew up in Chicago, and you see your face in there. As a child, as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old, actually, I saw my history represented in the Musée de Africain de l'Océanie, which is a horrible museum. But that was the very first time African artifacts were presented as majestic, as noble, as worth writing about. So there are spaces where we need to have that dialogue, that painful dialogue about what to do for people who belong to several worlds at the same time. How do you present their story within those spaces they're living in? So yeah, I completely understand. And we shouldn't be polarized when we have our opinion on the matter. It's a dialogue, a painful one.
It's very painful. It's a very painful passage. This is the last question we can take. How far can white people teach Black history? I love this, white people with a small w. But how far can white people teach Black history without falling into the trap of white-splaining? How can we use white privilege to amplify these histories without centering on whiteness? We got 4 whitenesses in here. So do you get this question?
Yeah, that's okay, a lot of W's.
What is it saying? What is it saying?
Basically, I don't know if I'm understanding correctly. Two aspects. Can white people teach Black history?
How far can white people teach Black history without falling into the trap of white-splaining? White-splaining. Okay. How can we use these are 2 questions. Okay, let's do the white-splaining first.
Okay, white-splaining is, falling the trap of paternalism. I'm going to tell you how you suffered and all the rest of it. That it's a trap, and I know many people who are well-meaning who fall into that trap. I think the way to go forward is to give the space, even when you're teaching to people of African descent, either as narrator, as presenter, and giving them that space where you step back, you teach, but you step back and you let the voices speak too. So it's a collaborative thing going on there. The second part was what?
I want to ask you, because he uses whiteness a lot in this question. What is whiteness?
Oh, no, you want to start a new lecture.
I know, and it's almost over.
A whole discipline, you know that. It's a whole discipline.
Yes.
It's the institution that is based on the privileges, if you would, associated with a color. And that is a historical privileges associated, historical, emotional, associated over time with a color. It comes with a color. But it's not just a color.
It's the credo as well. So we're going to have to stop because I want to do my praise song of you. So I'm ending by saying, thank you very much, Professor Olivette Otele, Professor of the History of the Memory of Enslavement at Bristol, Vice President of the Royal Historical Society, first Black woman to be made a full professor of history in this country. And you are also an enfant de la République and of Africa too. Merci beaucoup. And I, your presence is a blessing. Thank you. Thank you for African Europeans. It is a mighty book. Thank you for British Museum. Thank all of you who listen to us. And this is the era of reclamation and Akan Drum Talk. And we'll be back next month. And Olivette will be back as well. She's one of my supremes. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
And Encountering African Europeans will give you a story that you think you know. You actually may be convinced that you know. You'll find out. You don't know this one. Let's see. Thank you, Olivette. Thank you very much.